Hello everyone, welcome to my channel on English literature. This is a video on African literature which includes its history, literary forms, famous works, etc. So let's go through the slides. African literature. There are 54 nations which make up Africa. Each of these separate countries have their own history, culture, tribes and tradition. There are some common features shared by literature which comes from the continent as a whole. African literature was built upon the history of slavery, oppression, violation and humiliation. African works were written out of the disgustful life led by the Africans. Next slide is about the history of African literature. African literature has origins dating back thousands of years to ancient Egypt and hieroglyphs or writing which uses picture to represent words. These ancient Egyptian beginnings led to Arabic poetry which spread during the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century CE and through Western Africa in the 9th century CE. These African and Arabic culture continued to blend with European culture and literature to form a unique literary form. Africa experienced several hardships in its long history which left an impact on the themes of its literature. One hardship which led to many others is that of colonization. Colonization is when people leave their country and settle in another land, often one which is already inhabited. The problem with colonization is when the incoming people exploit the indigenous people and the resources of the inhabited land. Colonization led to slavery. Millions of African people were enslaved and brought to Western countries around the world from 16th to 19th centuries. This spreading of African people, largely against their will, is called the African diaspora. Sub-Saharan Africa developed a written literature during the 19th and early 20th centuries. This development came as a result of missionaries coming to the area. The missionaries came to Africa to build churches and language schools in order to translate religious texts. This led to Africans writing in both European and indigenous languages. Next heading is negritude. Although Africans had been writing in Portuguese as early as 1850 and a few volumes of African writing in English and French had been published, an explosion of African writing in European languages occurred in the mid-20th century. In the 1930s, black intellectuals from French colonies living in Paris initiated a literary movement called negritude. Negritude emerged out of a sudden grasp of racial identity and of cultural values and an awareness of the wide discrepancies which existed between the promise of the French system of assimilation and the reality. The movement's founders looked to Africa to rediscover and rehabilitate the African values that had been erased by French cultural superiority. Negritude writers wrote poetry in French in which they presented African traditions and cultures as antithetical but equal to European culture. Out of this philosophical or literary movement came the creation of Présence africaine by Elione Diop in 1947. The journal, according to its founder, was an attempt to define African originality and to hasten its introduction into the modern world. Other negritude authors include Leopold Senghor, Aimé Césaire, and Léon Demas. Some of the first African writings to gain attention in the West were the slave narratives, which described vividly the horrors of slavery and the slave trade. As Africans became literate in their own languages, they often reacted against colonial repression in their writings. Since the early 19th century writers from West Africa have used newspapers to air their views, French-speaking Africans in French led by Leopold Senghor were active in the negritude movement. After World War II, as Africans began demanding their independence, more African writers were published. Wole Soyinka, Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Ben Okri were some of the writers. All of these writers were writing in European languages and often they shared the same themes. The major themes were the clash between indigenous and colonial cultures, condemnation of European subjugation, pride in the African past, and hope for the continent's independent future. Much of contemporary African literature reveals disillusionment and dissent with current events. The Senegalese novelist Ousmane Sembène have moved into films to take their messages to people who cannot read. Literary forms. There are two kinds of literary forms or literatures in African literature. The first one is the oral literature and the second one is the written literature. So first we can look at the oral literature. Oral literature, also called as orature, have flourished in Africa for many centuries and take a variety of forms including folk tales, myths, epics, funeral dirges, praise poems and proverbs. These are the portraits of African oral tradition. The elders used to tell stories to the children and their culture and tradition is followed or transmitted to the next generation like this through the oral stories. Now let's examine the various forms of oral literature in detail. The first one is myth. Myth is a traditional story, especially one concerning the early history of people or explaining a natural or social phenomenon and typically involving supernatural beings or events. The major characters in myths are the supernatural humans, gods, and warriors. Epics. Epics are elaborate literary forms usually performed only by experts on special occasions. They often recount the heroic exploits of ancestors. Funeral dirges. These funeral dirges were chanted during funeral ceremonies, lament the departed, praise his or her memory, and ask for his or her protection. Praise poems. Praise poems are epithets called out in reference to an object, a person, an animal, a disease, and so on in celebration of its outstanding qualities and achievements. Praise poems have a variety of applications and functions. Professional groups often create poems exclusive to them. Prominent chiefs might appoint a professional performer to compile their praise poems and perform them on special occasions. Professional performers of praise poems might also travel from place to place and perform for families or individuals for a small fees. The last category is proverbs. Proverbs are short, witty, or ironic statements metaphorical in its formulation which aim to communicate a response to a particular situation, to offer advice, or to be persuasive. The proverb is often employed as a rhetorical device presenting its speaker as the holder of cultural knowledge or authority. Written literature. Written literature includes novels, plays, poems, hymns, and tales. Over 50% of Africa's population is illiterate and hence many Africans cannot access written literature. Scholars have identified three waves of literacy in Africa. The first occurred in Ethiopia, where written works have been discovered that appeared before the earliest literatures in the Celtic and Germanic languages of Western Europe. The second wave of literacy moved across Africa with the spread of Islam. Soon after the emergence of Islam in the 7th century, its believers established themselves in North Africa through a series of holy wars. In the 11th and 12th centuries, Islam was carried into the kingdom of Ghana. The religion continued to move eastward through the 19th century. The encounter with Europe through trade relationships, missionary activities, and colonialism propelled the third wave of literacy in Africa. In the 19th and 20th centuries, literary activity in the British colonies was conducted almost entirely in vernacular languages. Missionaries found it more useful to translate the Bible into local languages than to teach English to large numbers of Africans. This resulted in the production of hymns, morality tales, and other literatures in African languages concerned with propagating Christian values and morals. The first of these Christian-inspired African writings emerged in South Africa. The written literatures, novels, plays, and poems in the 1950s and 60s have been described as literatures of testimony. The African authors who produced literatures in European languages have been described as literatures of revolt. These texts move away from the project of recuperating and reconstructing an African past and focus on responding and revolting against colonialism and corruption. These literatures are more concerned with the present realities of African life and often represent the past negatively. Famous literary works. I had included a list of famous poems and novels in African literature. The famous poems are Paris in the Snow, Totem, Letters to Martha, Train Journey, Telephone Conversation, Africa, Song of Lavino, etc. There are a lot of famous poems in African literature, and here I'm just mentioned some of them. Famous African novels: The Houseboy, Things Fall Apart, Heart of Darkness, Arrow of God, A Grain of Wheat, Antles of Savannah, and The Joys of Motherhood. Some of the famous African writers are Chinua Achebe, Nadine Gordimer, Bessie Head, Buchi Emecheta, Nuruddin Farah, Nelson Mandela, Dennis Brutus, and Alice Walker. Of course, there are many other writers too, but I am not including all of their names here because it is just a brief intro. Themes of African literary works. The African writers published their works based on the common themes. Some of the themes were colonialism, liberation, nationalism, tradition, and displacement. Features of African literature. African literature is written in both African and European languages. Most of the African works represent different periods in African history. It also includes oral and written literature. We already discussed about this point, and the last point is that during colonization, written slave narratives documented horror of slavery. In the coming slides, I included the cover page of some famous books. If you are interested to know more about African culture, tradition, life, and their history, you can read these books.